husband did not know I had spent 3 years working as a paralegal before we met. He knew I had worked in an office somewhere, which was how he always summarized the first 30 years of my life, vaguely and without much interest. I was 62 years old when I finally understood that. We had been married for 19 years. 19 years of dinners I cooked, trips I planned, holiday cards I addressed by hand because he said my handwriting was nicer. 19 years of sitting at the edge of conversations he had with colleagues, with clients, with neighbors, while he introduced me as my wife Margaret, always with that slight pause before my name, like he was searching for it. I had been a paralegal for 11 years before we married. I knew how to read a contract. I knew what a quitclaim deed was. I knew the difference between a revocable and an irrevocable trust. None of that came up in conversation because my husband, Thomas, had decided early in our marriage that finances were his domain. You don't need to worry about any of that, he used to say, and back then I believed he meant it kindly. By the time I was 60, I understood it differently. We lived in Scottsdale, Arizona. Thomas had built a small but profitable commercial real estate business over the decades, mostly strip malls and small office parks in the Phoenix metro area. He was good at it. He worked long hours, traveled to meet investors, flew out to look at properties. I had stopped asking for details years ago because the answers were always the same: too complicated, too technical, nothing I needed to think about. He handled everything. I was supposed to handle the house. I did, beautifully, for 19 years. The trouble started, or rather I started noticing the trouble, about 2 years before everything unraveled. Small things first. A phone call he took in the garage with the door closed. A weekend trip to Denver that he mentioned on a Thursday and left for on a Friday without any of the usual lead time. A dinner he came home from where he smelled like a restaurant I had never heard of, though he said he'd eaten at his usual place near the office. I told myself I was imagining things. I was 60, I was sometimes tired, I was maybe becoming one of those women who read suspicion into ordinary life. I told myself that. But I had been a paralegal. Old habits don't leave you, they go quiet and then they wake up. I started paying attention differently, not dramatically. I didn't hire anyone or go through his phone. I just started listening to the rhythm of his days, to what matched and what didn't. And then he told me about the dinner. It was a Tuesday in October. He came into the kitchen where I was making soup and said, almost as an aside, that he had a business dinner that Friday with a Korean investor, a man named Mr. Demister, CO, who was considering putting significant capital into Thomas's next project, a mixed-use development near Tempe. Thomas said the dinner was at a Korean restaurant in Scottsdale, that it would be a small group, and that he wanted me to come. "You always make a good impression," he said. It was the nicest thing he'd said to me in months. I almost said no. I had a long-standing Friday dinner with my friend Patricia, and I didn't particularly enjoy being decorative at Thomas's work events. But something made me say yes. I can't explain it better than that. Something made me say yes. What Thomas did not know, what he had never thought to ask, was that I had studied Korean for nearly 4 years. I had started in 2019, during the first long stretch of the pandemic. Thomas was working from home and somehow still never home, always in his office with the door shut. I had time, and I had a restless mind, and my granddaughter had started watching Korean dramas and kept leaving them on in the living room. I found myself understanding words before I realized I was learning them. I downloaded an app. I found a tutor on Zoom, a woman named Ji Young, who lived in Seoul and taught online in the early mornings. I studied 5 days a week for 2 years. By 2022, I could hold a real conversation. By 2022, I could follow a business discussion without much trouble. I never mentioned it to Thomas, not out of strategy. I genuinely just never found the right moment. He wasn't interested in what I did with my days. The few times I'd mentioned learning Korean, he'd said something like, "That's cute, Margaret," and moved on. Eventually, I stopped offering pieces of myself to be dismissed. So I said nothing. and the skill sat quietly in me, the way things do when no one knows to ask. The restaurant was called Hangang, and it was beautiful in the way that serious Korean restaurants often are, spare and warm at the same time, dark wood and soft light, the smell of something rich and savory moving through the air. Thomas met his business associate, a man named Kevin who handled his investor relations, at the entrance. Mr. Sayer was already seated when we arrived. He was in his mid-50s, compact and very still in the way some powerful people are still, like they've learned that stillness itself communicates something. He stood to greet us and shook my hand with both of his, which is a gesture of respect I recognized. He had a colleague with him, a younger man named Jin-ho, who handled his financial due diligence. We sat down. The menus came. Thomas ordered for the table without asking anyone's preference, which he always did and which always made me tired. The conversation started in English. Thomas talked about the Tempe project, the square footage, the projected occupancy rates, the anchor tenants he was already in discussions with. He was charming in these settings, I'll give him that. He knew how to hold a room. About 20 minutes in, Mr. Seo said something quietly to Jin-ho in Korean. Just a short exchange. Jin-ho nodded. I kept my eyes on the menu. My face did not change. What Mr. Seo had said was, "Is the project documentation in order? The wife, does she have any involvement in the business?" Jin-ho had replied, "No involvement from what I can see. She seems like she's just here for decoration." I set down my water glass very carefully. Thomas did not react because Thomas did not understand. He smiled his business dinner smile and waited for Mr. Seo to return to English, which he did, asking a follow-up question about the financing structure. The evening moved along. Appetizers arrived. The conversation turned to timeline, to the permitting process in Maricopa County, to Thomas's track record with previous projects. I ate quietly. I nodded when addressed. I smiled when appropriate. And then I heard it. Thomas and Kevin were talking about the anchor tenant timeline, and Mr. Seo leaned slightly toward Jin-ho again and said, in Korean, something I will not forget. He said, "He's not telling us about the zoning dispute on the north parcel. My people flagged it last week. There's an active objection filed with the county. He's moving the wife's name off that parcel too. I saw a quitclaim deed recorded in September. He's protecting assets. This man is preparing for something, a divorce maybe, or a lawsuit." Jin-ho said very quietly, "What do you want to do?" Mr. Seo said, "I want to finish dinner. And then I want nothing more to do with this project." I breathed. I breathed steadily, and I looked at the banyan in front of me and I thought, there it is. 19 years, and there it is across a dinner table in Scottsdale, Arizona. The quitclaim deed, recorded in September. I had not known about it. I had not known about the zoning dispute. I had not known Thomas was moving assets. But I had been a paralegal. I knew exactly what all of those things meant. Thomas was talking, Kevin was nodding. The server came and poured water. I waited. And then, I still don't know exactly what made me choose that moment. I set down my fork, looked at Mr. Seo, and spoke to him in Korean. I said, "Forgive me for the interruption. I want to thank you for your candor just now. You're right about the quitclaim deed. I wasn't aware of it until this moment. I'm going to need a copy of what your team found, if you're willing to share it." The table went absolutely silent. Thomas stared at me, Kevin stared at me, Jin-ho looked at Mr. Seo with the expression of a man recalculating everything. Mr. Seo looked at me for a long moment, and then something shifted in his face, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition. He nodded slowly. He said in Korean, "How long have you spoken Korean?" I said, 4 years. My husband doesn't know." Thomas's voice came across the table. "Margaret, what is happening right now?" I looked at him. Not with anger. I was past anger by then, I think. I looked at him the way you look at something you finally decided to see clearly. I said, "I'll explain it to you later." Then I turned back to Mr. Seo and, in Korean, asked him if he would be willing to meet with me separately at his convenience. before he made any final decisions about the project. I told him that I had a professional background in real estate law and that I had some questions about the Maricopa County filing his team had found. Mr. CO said, "I'll give you my card." He said it in English so Thomas could hear. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and handed me his card directly, bypassing Thomas entirely. It was a small gesture and a very clear one. Thomas did not say a word. The dinner ended shortly after. There were no warm goodbyes. Thomas and Kevin had a brief, tight-lipped exchange in the parking lot. I got in the passenger seat of our car and looked straight ahead at the night sky over Scottsdale and thought about the quitclaim deed filed in September. I thought about what a quitclaim deed filed in September meant in October for a woman with 19 years of marriage and apparently no idea what was in her husband's name. Thomas didn't speak for 10 minutes. Then he said, "How long?" I said, "4 years." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "You never asked." That was the last real conversation we had in that house. I want to be honest about what came next because I've heard these stories told as if the woman immediately transforms into someone fearless and decisive, and that's not how it happened for me. There were nights I couldn't sleep. There was one afternoon when I sat in my car in the driveway for 40 minutes because I couldn't make myself go inside. There was grief in it, real grief, not just for the marriage, but for the version of it I had believed in, or wanted to believe in, for so long. But I had a paralegal's habits and I had a very good attorney. I called a friend from my old firm the morning after the dinner, a woman I had worked with 30 years ago who had since become one of the sharper family law attorneys in Phoenix. Her name was Connie. I told her everything. She said, "Get me everything in writing you can find and let me start looking." What Connie found over the following weeks was not small. The quitclaim deed Thomas had filed in September had transferred my name off a parcel in the Tempe development, a parcel I hadn't known I was on in the first place, because Thomas had handled all the paperwork, and I had signed things over the years without reading them. The way you do when you trust someone. The parcel's value was significant. Removing my name from it right before a divorce or a major legal dispute was precisely the kind of move that family courts in Arizona take a dim view of. There was also a secondary LLC Thomas had formed 18 months prior that I had no knowledge of. It held 2 properties in the East Valley. Neither was disclosed in any of the financial documents he had shown me. And the zoning dispute Mr. Sue's team had flagged was real, an active objection filed with Maricopa County by an adjacent property owner, which Thomas had not disclosed to any of his investors and had apparently been managing quietly for months. Connie filed for divorce on my behalf in November. The process was not fast and it was not easy. Thomas hired an aggressive attorney and spent the first 2 months trying to reclassify the LLC properties as separate business assets predating our marriage. It didn't hold up. The formation date was 18 months ago. The marriage was 19 years old. Arizona is a community property state. The parcel in Tempe, the one with my name quietly removed in September, was restored to the marital estate by court order. The judge was not warm about it. I will not give you the dollar amounts because they're not the point of this story, and also because Connie told me not to for reasons I understand. What I will tell you is that what I walked away with was more than fair, more than Thomas had intended, and enough to buy a small house in Tucson near my daughter's family, where I am writing this now. Mr. Seo, for what it's worth, sent a note to Connie's office about 6 weeks after the dinner. He declined to pursue the Tempe project. His note was brief and professional. He did not mention the dinner. He did not need to. There's something I've thought about a lot in the 2 years since all of this happened. People ask me, my daughter asks me, my friend Patricia asks me, why I never told Thomas I spoke Korean, why I kept it to myself all that time. The honest answer is that it wasn't a strategy. I didn't learn Korean to catch my husband at anything. I learned it because I was bored and curious and my granddaughter had good taste in television. I kept it to myself because Thomas had trained me over many years and in many small ways to not offer him things he wouldn't value. I stopped sharing pieces of myself with him somewhere around year 9 or 10, and I didn't notice I'd stopped until I was standing on the other side of it. But here's what I know now: the silence that he created in me became the thing that protected me. He built the distance that let me see him clearly. He assumed I wasn't paying attention because he had decided, very early on, the kind of woman I was: soft, trusting, decorative, and he never updated that assumption. Not in 19 years. That is a failure of imagination, and in the end, it cost him. I am 64 now. I have a house in Tucson with a garden I planted myself. The first garden I've had in 20 years because Thomas didn't like the upkeep. I study Spanish on Tuesday mornings with a group of women from my neighborhood. My granddaughter visits on weekends and we watch Korean dramas together, and she can't believe I understand them now. I am not angry anymore. I was for a long time, but anger is expensive, and I'm more careful with my resources now. If you are listening to this and you are in a marriage where you feel like a guest in your own life, where your history gets summarized in one sentence, where your name comes with a pause before it, pay attention to that feeling. It is not imagination, it is not age, it is information. And whatever you've quietly learned, whatever skill or knowledge or clarity you've been keeping to yourself because no one thought to ask, hold on to it. You may not know yet what it's for. I think about that October dinner a lot. Not with bitterness anymore, more the way you think about a moment when the lights finally came on in a room you'd been sitting in the dark for years. What Thomas never understood was that everything he got away with because I trusted him. And everything that eventually caught up with him for exactly the same reason. Because he trusted that I was who he decided I was. A woman who signed papers without reading them. A woman who smiled through business dinners and asked no questions. A woman who had quietly stopped learning, stopped growing, stopped being curious about the world. He made that assumption in year 2 of our marriage, and he never revisited it. That was his real mistake. Not the quitclaim deed, not the hidden LLC, not the undisclosed zoning dispute. Those were just the consequences of a much earlier decision, the decision to stop seeing me. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes to survive something like this, and I don't think it's one thing. It's three working together, and you need all of them. The first is integrity, not as an abstract virtue, but as a daily practice. I could have used what I overheard in a dozen uglier ways. I could have gone home and said nothing and quietly built a case in secret. Instead, I spoke. At the dinner table, in Korean, clearly, I named what I had heard. There is something clarifying about honesty, even when, especially when, it's frightening. It put everything on the table, including me, and it meant that when my attorney walked into that courtroom, we had nothing to hide and everything to stand behind. The second is the willingness to keep developing yourself, even when no one is watching and no one seems to care. I learned Korean in a kitchen during a pandemic while my husband worked behind a closed door 20 feet away. I studied with Ji Young on Zoom at 6 in the morning because it made me feel alive. I wasn't building a strategy. I was just refusing to let myself go flat. That refusal, that quiet, private insistence on growing, turned out to be the most important thing I did in the last decade of my marriage. Not because it gave me an advantage, though it did, but because it kept some essential part of me intact. The third is the endurance to go through the long middle part. The divorce wasn't a dramatic reveal and then a clean ending. It was months of legal filings and tense phone calls and days when I didn't know how it would resolve. Connie was brilliant, but the process still asked a great deal of me. I had to stay steady through it. Show up, not collapse. That steadiness came from somewhere I'd been quietly building for years without realizing it. What Thomas did was wrong. What he did had consequences: financial, professional, personal. That's not me being righteous about it. That's just how it works. The choices we make accumulate. They compound. His did, and so did mine. I'm 64. I have a garden in Tucson that I planted myself. I have a granddaughter who watches Korean dramas on my couch and laughs when I catch a joke she thought I'd miss. I didn't set out to be a woman with a story like this, but I'll tell you this much: I'm glad I was paying attention when it mattered.